everyone, and welcome back to Simcyp Technical Webinar. My name is Champagne. I'm part of the Translational DMPK group at Simcyp. I will host the session today. So today's topic focuses on Introduction to Ocular PBPK Modeling in Simcyp Simulator. Before we start the talk, I'd like to kindly request that everyone stays muted during the presentation. Should you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand or post your query in the chat box. We will have a dedicated Q&A segment at the end where we will address all of them. We are recording the presentation, which will be available on YouTube shortly. Next slide, please.
Oops, sorry.
And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, my colleague Brian Holland. Brian was training in computational biophysics. He's the lead of the Ocular project and also work on long-acting injectable drug model and permeability limited tissue models. I'm glad to have him with us today. The talk today will cover the overview of the Ocular model, including the topical and intravitreal dosage rules involving the diffusive and other dynamic processes, melanin binding, and also general metabolic clearance. Without further ado, I will hand over to Brian. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, thank you, Shen. I'm just going to turn my camera off now just for the sake of bandwidth as well. And yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. And basically the idea today is just to get a good broad overview of the work we've been doing on the ocular model since for a few years now, but just recently introduced in version 23. And with some enhancements coming in some new features coming in version 24 as well, upcoming. So I just wanted to very quickly introduce everyone to the ideas and concepts basically behind the model. So just a quick recap. It doesn't seem to, there we go, of the eye itself. For those of you who may not be as familiar, just a reminder just how complex the eye is, really, and that at least according to optometrists anyway, it is the second most complex organ in the entire body. So there's a massive amount of connectivity between tissues in a really complex geometric space. And generally, what we do is we break the eye up into two different portions. So the model that we'll be seeing actually does encompass the entire eye, and we break it up into an anterior portion, which is basically the portion in front of the lens. So that would be the cornea and aqueous humour and a couple other tissues. And then the posterior portion is everything behind the lens. This just gives you a schematic overview of the model's connectivity on the right-hand side here. And this is, of course, this is a connectivity diagram, so it gives you a general idea of the flow. And there's a lot of arrows going everywhere is the one thing I would say. So it's complex in that regard. The eye isn't huge, but it is really complex for its size. At a very high level, we essentially have a compartmental type model with some extra complexity when you drill down into a couple of the compartments, and we'll get into that extra complexity in a little bit, especially in the cornea, aqueous humour, and a couple other compartments that we have been focusing on for right now. Currently, there are two dosage routes that are available. These are two of the more common dosage routes, which is why we focus on them at the beginning, which is topical dosing and intravitreal injections. Both are currently only available with solution as well in small molecules. And we'll get to potential questions about biologics maybe towards the end. We have researched physiological parameters for all the input here, I'll quickly. I'm not going to be showing I can't figure out where my cursor is. 1 second. Okay, I won't be showing the simulator too much, just for the sake of time. I can go through it a little bit more towards the end if they're in the question period, if you have any questions. But just to give you a very quick idea in the population eye section, all of these parameters are researched and provided for you for humans as far as a healthy human or healthy human volunteers are concerned as well. And so some highlights with respect to, just to give you an idea of sort of how the dosing pathways proceed from the topical dosing. So the tier is usually, or is where the topical dose ends up, and a huge amount of that usually ends up in the nasolacrimal duct, which is recycled through the stomach back into the systemic, and that often ends up in the posterior of the eye as well. The conjunctiva picks up quite a large amount as well, and then there's a cornea as well. That the cornea that we've split up into two subdivisions and subtissues, being the epithelium and stroma. And I'll get into the details in a couple slides here, just about how we've dealt with the permeability barriers that are involved in the cornea, and as well as other physical phenomena in the aqueous humor as well, and trying to model that using finite elements. The lens itself is actually not modeled as a separate compartment in this model. It's just a permeability barrier. Right, and as far as the posterior, so that's all the bluish gray stuff here at the back. This is all there are fewer tissues, but it does encompass the vast majority of the volume of the eye, the vitreal cavity being by far the largest component. And we'll see in a little bit as well that it was modeled in, at least for version 24, and then elements as well to also capture diffusion appropriately. Some other highlights that we'll see at the end as well is the introduction of melanin binding and general clearance as well for the newer version. And so just to give you a quick idea of how you might run a simulation, or just being a technical webinar, what you need to do. And again, if you need some more ideas, or if you have any questions, I can show you at the end in the simulator itself, but we'll just rely on screenshots for the time being. These are all from version 24 as well, by the way, so that's a sneak peek at the new UI. So if you don't recognize that, that's why. But it's all very similar to version 23. It just looks a little bit different, especially with the colors. So the two main routes, as mentioned, are topical and intravitreal injection. We do intend to add other formulations in future releases as well, as well as implants. But as far as we can still do a controlled release profile, but going to the formulation tab. So this is all accessible through, so the previous one was all in your dosing tab and going to selecting Ocular from your normal substrate dosing selection. And if I can actually quickly show you, going down to the substrate and absorption. When you have that ocular dose selected, the Ocular tab will actually become available, and you can go into the permeability or formulation, or the diagram is also here as well. So going to the formulation, you can see the bolus and release profile, and the release profile will bring up a standard release setup, controlled release setup for Simcyp that other Simcyp users are probably used to, and you can either define them single profile for both topical and intravitreal, or create separate ones. So reasonably simple, but should be able to encompass a large amount of release profiles that people may need to do that we currently aren't capable of doing mechanistically at the moment. All right, so just moving on, I just wanted to talk a bit more about the model as well, and just sort of a little bit about some of how we, at least through one pathway anyway. And so I'm going to talk about going from the tier through into the aqueous humor from a topical perspective, because this is one area that we focused on reasonably heavily, because this is it was a sort of a barrier to getting good validated results with some of the data that we had. And so in the tear, there's actually two forms of drainage in the tear. There's natural tear production. This is your tear that is always being produced in your eye and always being drained from your eye. So anytime you're just blinking and just living your life, that is a natural tear that is going in and out of your eye. But when you add a dose and you add a drop from a dropper, there's excess fluid that's added, and your eye can only hold so much. And so we've modeled it such that whatever your conjunctival stack is capable of holding, any extra above that is just going to be lost. And on top of that, there's excess drainage as well during that time. So there's an increased drainage rate. Is it okay if someone just hits their mute button? Thank you. And sorry, with that extra drainage rate, you have much faster drainage. So what ends up happening is when you have a larger volume of crop, it actually draining a lot, and you lose a lot more to the nasolacrimal duct as well. So that's a fairly important piece to keep in mind when doing topical dosing. With respect to the cornea, I mentioned I was going to get into the details a little bit about both the epithelial and stroma layers. And so one thing that we did work on was predictions, and it's not just predictions for this. I'll mention predictions for a whole bunch of other physiomolecular properties as well. But specifically for the cornea, we have used some prediction methods provided by Edward and Protsnitz. We did some work on this, some modeling work, and basically the point being that you, especially for hydrophilic substances, this is fairly important, especially for the epithelial layer. It tends to create or give you quite low diffusion coefficients. And so one thing that we were facing, so these predictions are provided for you in the permeability cornea area in absorption. But one of the problems that we were facing with, especially with hydrophilic substances, was that even with fairly low diffusion coefficients, we were still getting pretty fast diffusion across those layers because the epithelium is so thin. And so a way that we dealt with this problem was to introduce finite elements into our model. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what finite elements are, you basically break the problem up into layers or into sections for 1D anyway, for one-dimensional systems. And so we take advantage of the radial symmetry, and breaking it up, it forces compounds to actually have to cross, each one of these little sections and have to diffuse across it in the model. And just that little bit of extra, or even if you had just a few, like say 3, or we actually use about 30, but even if you had 3 or 4 layers, that little bit of extra time lag that you enforce upon the compound makes a massive difference in the amount of time that it takes to get across the layers. And so we got much better results for hydrophilic compounds, especially through the epithelium. And so likewise, I'm rushing through this obviously, so if anyone has any questions about this at the end, there's just a lot to get through, so please ask away towards the end or send me an email. I'm happy to respond that way as well. So for topical administration, still we made it to the aqueous humor now. We've made it through the cornea, and this presented its own challenges, being a relatively large chamber, and then you have also spatial distribution of clearance routes. So the clearance would happen, say, at the back of the humor as well as at the sides and at different spots in the side. So to try to model that, as well as some convective flow of the fluid itself, aqueous humor is actually moderately close to water from a viscosity perspective. We decided to use 2-dimensional finite elements as well. And I'll show you in a second the convective flow So, so there's one paper that we relied reasonably heavy on some modeling from this group and another group. They were able to show that, very interestingly, that even with a really small temperature difference between the inside and the outside of the humour of 3 degrees, you get this fairly massive convective flow. I mean, it's fairly low, as far as speeds we think of, but as far as the drug distribution is concerned, it has a pretty large effect on the distribution within the humour. And you can see here, this is a simulation that I ran with the flow off. So you still have all the two-dimensional finite elements working here, but you have this radial symmetry, which you'd expect because everything's just coming in from the one side. And once you turn the flow on, all the drug now is on the outside, and that has huge effects on the clearance and the exposure. And you can see that down here in the humour, especially, that it's an order of magnitude difference, really, in the exposure between having the flow on and the flow off. So it's able to clear it much, much better with that convective flow. So that's something that we've added a model within the aqueous humour. Other predictions, I think I mentioned previously that we also make are we have QSPR models for a whole bunch of other physiomolecular properties as well, in the conjunctiva, the retina, the choroid. We obviously strive to make it so that the user at least has some prediction for all the values as much as possible. As well as for in version 24, we have provided a QSPR model for diffusion in the vitreous as well. Currently, it still uses Stokes-Einstein, which is also available in version 24 if desired. So on to intravitreal administration. I'm running low on time here, so I'll try to be quick. This presented even greater problems, first from a diffusion perspective, because as mentioned, and as you can tell here, the size of it is just, it's much, much larger than the anterior portion of the eye, and it's the vast majority of the volume. And it's also much more viscous. You have collagen fibers in a gel-like substance within there, so the viscosity is very high. So we decided to also model this, especially for the sake of intravitreal injections, to force the compound to have to actually diffuse through the matrix was sort of basically the idea. And you can see here, especially on the left-hand side, this plot, this is from version 23, and this is identical. This is just using the default values, just setting up a default intravitreal dose and just running it, that the exposure is dramatically different from a time scale. And not only that, but the exposure in the retina, which is usually the target of intravitreal injections, is massively different. So this is very important. You have a much lower Cmax and a much higher Tmax. So it's a pretty exciting addition for version 24 to have this in there as well. Another thing that we need to deal with is both something we needed to deal with, but also a plus from a realistic perspective, is to have to deal with the geometry of the injection as well. So now that we have this actual space, this three-dimensional space within the vitreal cavity, we need to be able to put the injection somewhere within it, because it matters which finite elements actually take the dose. And as you can see in the top right here, this is looking at the exposure, the concentration time curves as a function of the injection depth, and beside that is a function of the syringe angle. So injection depth is how deep, of course, and the angle is sort of what angle this is at from the clinician, the syringe is at. And both of them have, quite a large effect. It really matters where you put that injection, because it's the closer it is to the retina or say the anterior portion of the eye, the sooner it will be able to clear from the vitreal cavity, and it won't have to traverse across the whole space. So a couple things just quickly here that we've added for V24 as well is the idea of melanin binding. And melanin is a fairly common compound within the eye. Most people are probably familiar with it. It's fairly, there's a fairly large number of compounds that bind to it with fairly high affinity, and it's found in the retina, iris, and choroid for the most part. And we've provided researched abundances in the for the human populations for those 3 tissues. And the only thing that we require from the user is in vitro binding assay information for their compound. And with that, you can see some results here. And it's interesting because it really matters on which way you go. So if you're doing a topical or intravitreal dose, you get very different effects. So in the topical dose, most of the drug actually gets to the retina from the systemic. So it's actually the choroid, which is outside of the retina. I'd have to show you the picture again, but you have to trust me on that. That basically binds most of the drug in this case. And so you get very little in the retina for your total exposure. Whereas in the intravitreal, it's going directly to the retina. And so you get a much larger exposure for the total concentration. And you can see the same thing for the choroid here, as just mentioned. And finally, we've also added just generic metabolic clearance, both static and dynamic, which is, of course, critical for many compounds, and depending on your specific data and your specific compound, it's something that we just didn't have in version 23, and we've added it so that we can have more robust, useful simulations in version 24 as well. And that's available in the elimination tab in substrate elimination. So with that in mind, Jen, oh, sorry, one more slide. I forgot about this one. Just a quick blurb, just with respect to how you would actually go about, or since I have it here, we should just go to the outputs. Ocular profiles are provided in the PK profiles, and simply clicking on that will take you to the sheet options. It doesn't take you right down to it, unfortunately, but if you just scroll down, you can find all the MECDAO model profiles, which can be turned on and off individually for your Excel sheet output. And with that, yeah, thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming. I know that was a very quick tour of a lot of information. So if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer right now and later as well, of course, if need be.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. So if you got any questions, you can either raise your hand if you like to speak, or you could type your question in the chat for us to read aloud. There actually one question in the chat box asking about the access to this model, whether it's available in version 24 or we need to purchase as a separate module.
Right. So fairly common question. It is in fact a separate module. It has an independent license. You would have to talk to licensing about that. I believe it is not available in the standard or the default version of Simcyp.
Okay, we have. Okay. Do you want to follow up, Mary? Thank you.
It's not really a follow-up. It's more asking, since it is a separate from the rest of the Simcyp simulator, is there any way to see if there's ocular exposure after systemic administration?
Currently, no. I don't. The eye has not been included, to the best of my knowledge, in as a tissue in the full PBPK model. If that's more what you're getting at, we have had some interest from a toxicological point of view, and just exposure from a systemic perspective. So we're looking into those things basically, and where it's just difficult which way. To figure out which way we want to use our resources with respect to that. And okay. Also just what, whether we want to include it as a full tissue or perhaps have, because usually it's a better idea to have the full eye available, right? So just having that as a separate tissue in the full PBPK may not be as useful, right? So currently you can do, it is on our list actually to, at least from the ocular perspective, be able to do IV and oral dosing. And look at the impact on the eye. So you can do it through Lewis scripts right now, though. I can do an IV dose or a Lewis script and have it and do the same experiment. It's just not as user friendly. That's all.
And then as one more follow-up question, with the eye model as it is right now, are you able to determine degree of like leaching into the systemic circulation from the ocular administration?
Oh yes, for sure. Yeah, we have it fully connected to the systemic, so you can run full PBPK with the eye.
Okay.
Well, or minimal. You can run full simulations with the eye on, for sure. Yep. And so everything goes into the systemic. As I think I think I showed that one slide with. I can go back to it very quickly here. 1 second, sorry. If you just look at the diagram here, right? The tear film goes into the nasolacrimal. And well, I mean, we have systemic connections everywhere, but at least from topical dosing, a massive amount goes to the nasolacrimal, then to the stomach. And so you're also getting, you can use the atom model as well, or first order absorption, and minimal or full PBPK for the systemic. And so yes, any dosing that you do here, you can look at its effect on the rest of the body, for sure. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Think
Okay,
Will.
then Will, go ahead.
Yeah, I basically had the same question as the first of those questions. From a toxicological point of view, we often get off-target hits or even primary target hits that are in the retina for drugs that are administered orally, and we don't know the absorption into the eye or the uptake into the eye. So shall I come to you if we've got any issues like that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
For sure. We that is toxicology seems to be a fairly big interest for the model, just because there's like you said, so many off-target hits on the retina, especially. There seems to be a lot of retinal damage caused by a lot of compounds. So we're definitely available to help with that.
Okay, we got one more question from Yan. Are the ocular parameters based on the healthy volunteers? Can you easily adapt this to mimic the disease status?
Disease state. We haven't thought too much about disease state yet. I know that I have been able to adapt it to an animal model pretty easily. So I would imagine that. So to give you an example of how I've taken the human simulator, and basically if I ran first order absorption and minimal PBPK, and the one issue, the only small issue there is the liver, basically, but you can basically give it a rabbit liver. I've turned that into a rabbit basically, and I was able to get very, to validate the results against my prototype models that I was using a rabbit with as well. And so I imagine that you could turn that into the disease state relatively easily. As well, especially if you're concerned with disease state of the eye specifically, or disease state of other portions of the body. Sorry, that was a question back to the. I mean, we don't have it for, we don't have disease states yet, I guess is maybe the short answer, but you can certainly adapt it as necessary.
But your question is within the eye.
Within the eye. So I mean, at least as far as our model parameters will allow, I guess it depends on the disease state. Basically, it depends on the disease. When it comes to like the macular degeneration and diseases like that, it depends on if it's going to be affecting the thickness of the retina. We can adjust the thicknesses. So that is one thing that we can do. So it's usually geometric values, at least right now physiologically, that we can affect within the eye. So we'd have to look into that a little bit more. I can't answer that maybe as completely as you might like at the moment, but there's certainly some things we could do. I think it would depend on the disease.
Okay, I hope that answers your question. We get one more comment from Kevin. The question is their ability to use a release profile in one of the compartments of the eye.
A release profile in one of the compartments. So I guess if I understand the question correctly, me and my PowerPoint or not working out well here. I'm having to do that too much. My apologies, but I'm assuming then that you mean, would I be able to say do a controlled release in the conjunctiva, perhaps, instead of just in the tear or vitreous humor? Currently, no, is the answer to that. Currently, the controlled release would be, if I was doing a topical dose, that would be controlled release on the tear or for the tear, and likewise for the vitreal cavity. Those are the two areas that we focused on right now. So you can't just do it in any compartment. Typically, when we add dosing in Simcyp, it's in a specific area. But if you do have a specific compartment in mind that you would like to do release in, please let us know. I mean, if we would like all the feedback as that we can get, where people might be interested in actually adding dose or administration routes, right? Because I know there's many different ways to there's many different ways to dose to the eye. It's complex in that respect as well. So it's going to take us a while to get to all of them in a formal way, but please let us know what might be of more interest to you.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, we will now conclude today's webinar. Thank you to Brian for giving us an introduction to the ocular model in Simcyp. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Should you have any additional queries later on, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. I'll give you, Brian, some time to do the last slides. I think most of you already say them. So our next technical webinar is scheduled for 2025 on the 12th of February, and Divyan Shah will talk about the VBE module in the Simcyp simulator. So if you are interested in it, please register through the members area. Once again, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to seeing you soon. Wish you all a lovely holiday season and goodbye. See you next year.